this might be a conversation that appeals to those of you who've joined us from outside the China studies field, I suspect a lot of people will have tuned in because you share the feeling of many China specialists and certainly historians that there's a huge gap between what we tend to know as specialists and what the wider world seems to understand about China. So let me say who our speakers are this evening on this question of what it is that frustrates UK historians of China. Coming, I hope, visibly as well as audibly from outside, but welcome anyway, is Dr. Rachel Leow from the University of Cambridge. We've brought in a ringer from the other side. She is University Senior Lecturer there and author of many very distinguished articles and of the book Taming Babel, Language in the Making of Malaysia. That was published in 2016. After Rachel, the second speaker is our own Professor Robert Chard, Associate Professor of Classical Chinese, Fellow of St. Anne's College, Oxford, although he's in fact, I think, doing sterling work by staying awake in the middle of the night since he's currently located in Japan, I think, and he's been recently visiting professor at University of Tokyo and is also visiting professor at the moment, guest professor at Peking University. He is the author of Creating Confucian Authority, the Field of Ritual Learning in Early China, which is going to be appearing, in fact, later this year. And third on my list, but by no means least in terms of expertise and knowledge, is Professor Henrietta Harrison, fellow of the British Academy, a very distinguished scholar of China from really the 18th up to the 20th centuries. She has written numerous books, and the most recent, so recent it ought to say like Professor Chard's is not yet out, is The Perils of Interpreting, the extraordinary tale of two translators between Qing China and the British Empire. And I suspect that, like so many of her other books, will meet with a very warm reception when it comes out from Princeton University Press later this year. So all of you are immensely expert in teaching, writing about, and thinking about Chinese history. What I'm going to do is to call on you, as it were, in sort of chronological order, starting with Robert Chard, then Henrietta Harrison, then Rachel Leow. And with this sort of idea of what the gap is between what specialists know and what they wish the wider scholarly and indeed general public would understand, Robert, where do your frustrations lie on this front? Over to you.
Right. Well, I suppose popular conceptions and frustrations, throwing those together, I suppose for me, it's not so much popular conceptions, but really the lack of any conceptions at all. So our education system generally, I think, is quite Eurocentric. I recall an anecdote, I don't want to get too political, but in the very late 80s, when the national curriculum was being set up, the British Association for Chinese Studies spent something like 18 months putting together a proposal to insert into the national curriculum to teach students about China, probably mainly in the context of history. And it got all the way to the final version. The Prime Minister, as was then, went through it, I won't mention names, and struck out the line saying, this is a British education system. Students should be learning about Britain, underline, underline. And that was that. It was gone, just like that. So a lot of people obviously just weren't and still aren't convinced of the necessity for it, but also it's just a blank. It's not even, we don't know about China and we don't care. It's rather, oh, we don't. So one reason people, I think, give for why should we care is, what does it mean to us? I mean, there isn't any connection, especially sort of pre-modern China. What's that got to do with anything? And one of my favorite stories, I think, is to take us back to the 14th century. The 1350s, one decade, the London Mint, records of the London Mint show more than 9,000 kilograms of silver coinage being produced, which was a height not again reached until Napoleonic times. And so that is a very strange peak then. Most of that silver was Chinese, and it flowed when the Mongols put China under a paper currency. The silver flowed westward, and the Mongol princes were engaging in ventures to acquire cobalt and horses and carpets and all kinds of things. All manner of goods were flowing eastward, and masses of silver was flowing westward. Venetian merchants in their diaries remarked on this. Where's all this silver coming from all of a sudden? It's very white, whiter than we're used to, but it's good silver. It's the real thing. The London Mint, 9,000 kilos in the 1350s. In the 1360s, it was just a few hundred, something like 900. Why suddenly gone? Well, the reason was, of course, that in China, the yuan regime fell and paper money became worthless, and the world's silver got hoovered straight back into China. So already then you have quite a conspicuous global system developing with the Mongols. It didn't last, but it really showed how closely connected things were. I suppose another peeve too is China now presents itself as a country, and it has done a fair bit of ideological and indoctrinating reinvention to be able to bring that about. But you go back into my sort of periods, and it's very misleading to think of China as a country. It's really an entire civilization. You could, of course, say the same thing about India, but in our minds, China is a country. When I say our, I mean the Western mind. China is a country like France or Germany or Spain, and sort of coexists with them and is an equal status with them. But that again really isn't. So, I mean, there are all sorts of things I could mention too. I think probably that's about as far as we need. East Asia generally, just to conclude, is really been sort of an equal, balanced, civilized set of civilizations on the other end of Eurasia that very often was a way bigger in terms of technology and in terms of especially the economy. And in some ways right now, what we're seeing isn't the rise of East Asia. What we're seeing is a restoration of a more natural historical balance that goes back 2,000 years or more. I think that's probably as far as I'll go at the moment, just to give other voices a chance to vent their frustrations.
Thanks very much indeed, Robin. That was an immensely elegantly put set of frustrations, if indeed frustrations can be elegant. Sounds like actually one of those sort of books that someone like our wonderful colleague Craig Clunas might write. Elegant Frustrations strikes me as a monograph title waiting to be taken up. But thank you for starting us off in such good form. I'm going to turn to our next panelist. That's Henrietta Harrison. Henrietta, I think your frustrations lie a little later chronologically, so could I hand over to you?
Yes, and I was partly responsible for inventing this version of the title of the whole series. And once I got going, I felt extremely frustrated in composing these. So I guess any historian's frustrations depend a bit on what they themselves have most recently been researching. And in my case, that's obviously China's early relations with Britain, because of this book I've just finished. And that's been around the Mccartney Embassy of 1793 and the Amherst Embassy of 1816. Well, the Amherst Embassy has been almost entirely forgotten, which is pretty understandable. So the key issue here in terms of frustrating ideas are all around the Mccartney Embassy and the power of the long-standing narratives of the Mccartney Embassy and how they've shaped understandings of 19th century China and its relations with Britain, despite generations now of demolition by historians, really going back to the 1950s and 60s. And the two most tiresome ones, which get asked to me endlessly, are firstly, isn't it important, the importance of the kowtow to the Mccartney Embassy? And we still see this word kowtowing to China still comes up in the news and everything. And the idea that Lord Mccartney failed to kowtow, and for that reason, the Qianlong Emperor refused to receive him. And obviously the implication of this is that the Qing dynasty were obsessed with ancient Confucian ideas, meaningless rituals, and completely clueless about rising British powers. And then the other equally annoying one is the issue of the gifts. So the narrative that the Qianlong Emperor rejected Mccartney's gifts, which would have taught him about Western science and technology, and was totally self-satisfied. And the implication of this is that the failure of 19th century China to industrialize was due to the short-sighted focus on Confucian ideas of the Qing dynasty again. Now, these are basically two interpretations masquerading as facts, which are amazingly widely known by the British public, which often knows, as Robert just stated, nothing else about China. Both were first put forward, as pointed out by James Heavier years ago, by 19th century British writers who wanted to put the blame for the Opium War of 1840 onto the Chinese. And they were then exacerbated by the fact that until very recently, it has also suited 20th century Chinese governments to depict their great predecessor, the Qing, in this kind of condemnatory light. But I'm also struck thinking about it now that despite all the political excitement in the direction of world history and broader understandings of our country that has been going on in the last year or two, 19th century British politics and its historiography is still immensely influential in how Britain's past relations with China are seen. While at the same time, British imperial rule in India and its of very obvious importance for Britain's policies towards China at that point are almost entirely overlooked. And I should like to suggest that you go away and read Jessica Hanser's Mr. Smith Goes to China, which will make you understand the very close links that were going on at that time.
Thanks very much, Henrietta. Well, reading recommendations are certainly, I think, welcome as part of the conversation. So that's very good to have that there. Let me turn to Rachel. Thank you for joining us from Cambridge, Rachel. And may I turn to you and ask, what is it that frustrates you about the way that China is understood here in the UK?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. This is a great conversation to be part of. So I'll just jump straight into it. I guess my key frustration is really centering around uninformed perceptions of Chinese people that make the phrase "go back to where you came from" have any historical meaning at all. In one sense, of course, this applies more broadly to racism in societies that have, historically large flows of immigration. The Windrush generation or the Issei and Nisei Japanese Americans. The phrase is already in those cases patently absurd. But I think it is uniquely complicated when it comes to Chinese, because I think, as both Henrietta and Robert have already suggested, the word Chinese in English does a huge amount of semantic work. It's a civilizational signifier captured by the Chinese word hua. It's a racial or ethnic signifier, which we can problematically say is represented by Han. It's the citizenship of an entity called Zhongguo. And it's also a popular term for a language that actually functions as a kind of generic umbrella for a whole bunch of lots of different languages like Cantonese and Hakka, and a much more modern construction of Putonghua and lots of other things. And so in addition to this already existing complexity about Chinese, each of those signifiers are really deeply historically constituted. And so I think, as I think I mentioned earlier to the panelists beforehand, I didn't grow up, or I didn't learn history in the UK. So I don't have a good sense of what is taught apart from what I see through the admissions essays. But from what I can tell from the admissions essays, it mostly seems to be Mao and the Great Leap Forward that gets taught here. And I think actually a better understanding of 20th century history and China's place in it beyond Mao and the Great Leap Forward might actually make that historicity of Chineseness much clearer, and actually would make clear how Britain and its machinations in Asia very much had a hand in all of it. So just to share one example, following Henrietta on, talking about things that have been on my mind recently, and actually something that annoyed me so much that I actually had to make a film about it so it would reach more people. I've been writing around a series of deportations of Chinese people from British Malaya to China in and around 1949, which were carried out as part of the Malayan Emergency, which was Britain's war against communism in Malaya, and became highly ethnicized because of the mapping of Chineseness onto communism. And these deportations were carried out under the sanitized title of repatriations, which would suggest that these people were literally being sent back to where they came from. But of course, many of these repatriated were not actually born in China, had literally never seen the place before. These people might have been ethnically Chinese, but they were not nationally Chinese or Chinese by citizenship. They might also well have not been culturally Chinese or not spoken Chinese languages, but might rather have spoken Malay or English. And so in English language terms, we'd say they were Chinese, but then that actually masks a wide range of different Chinese or non-English terms for them, like Huaran or Tongyan in Cantonese, or Tionghoa in Indonesian, and so forth. All of these are terms that suggest they're local-born, not China-born identities. And yet here they were being sent back literally, apparently to where they came from, i.e. China. Then there's also the vastly complex geopolitics of the time, which I'm sure Rana is much better placed to talk about at the time, but essentially it's not even clear what China was at the time either, given that it was in the process of becoming two Chinas of the Cold War, resulting in what people like Enze Han and other scholars have referred to as a bifurcated homeland. So when you send Chinese back home, which are you sending them back to the PRC or the ROC? It wasn't very clear. And that geopolitics had enormous consequences for these repatriated Chinese being sent back to China. So I won't sort of go any more into that, but I'm really happy to bang on about it in the Q&A if needed. But the point is that the English word Chinese is really very ill-equipped to convey all of this. And so the phrase "go back to where you came from" really makes me mad, because I'm like, where is that? The most recent abuse of this unnuanced Chinese was, of course, gifted to the world by America's erstwhile president and his Chinese virus, which has opened up a truly disturbing space in Britain and America for anti-Asian racism and violence that actually is not very well captured by contemporary terms like BME or POC and the whole politics of trying to name different forms of oppression. And that makes me mad too, because not only is Chinese super complicated, but also out of plain ignorance, anti-Chinese violence targets literally non-Chinese people like Koreans, Filipinos, as well as Singaporeans and Malaysians who are only Chinese in the historically constituted way I've alluded to. So I do think that in our current climate and given developments in China and Hong Kong currently, Chinese immigration into Britain is going to be an issue of great importance going forward. And I fear that will create lots of opportunity for me to get even more annoyed or distraught about all of this in due course. So I think what it means really is that not only should we try to study China more closely, I think we really need to broaden our understanding of what we mean and what we're doing when we teach about China. So I'll stop there.
Rachel, thank you very much. And again, extremely well put, with a whole variety of things that we can and will unpack in the next half an hour or so. This is an event, this particular conversation, oriented towards history and historians and the significance of that particular element. There will be future ones. As a historian, most recently of the World War II period in China myself, I find quite often when the subject comes up, which it doesn't that often, with just kind of British interlocutors, a quite frequent question is, was China in the Second World War? And then the follow-up question is, which side was it on? And of course, as we know, the correct answer is, well, it depends whether you're asking about Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong or whether you're asking about Wang Jingwei. So the answer, of course, like France, is both sides. Anyway, we will not go too far into that particular rabbit hole, I would say. But let's concentrate on this question of what it is that people fail to understand in the UK about China, and perhaps moving towards how we might be able to do something to throw some light upon the darkness, so to speak. But let me throw one back, which in a sense gets to the heart, I think, of how one might answer the people who either have these quite fundamental misunderstandings about Chinese history, or perhaps even worse, think it doesn't matter at all. Robert, could I take you back to that Prime Minister you've mentioned? I don't know, it was Lord Palmerston, perhaps on a bit later on that case. Well, one could say that Lord Palmerston at least did care about China as an issue, even if not necessarily in the most healthy of ways. If you'd been in the room with that Prime Minister when she or he, we don't know, underlined and said, they should be learning about British history, what would be the argument in a busy world where people have all sorts of things on their plates to say that actually British school children, if you want to start with that, should be learning about Chinese history? Why should it matter to them?
Well, I suppose there's an assumption that learning the history of anywhere is somehow being indoctrinated into their point of view rather than your own. And I would say, I don't think you have to worry about that. Certainly wouldn't have thought so, that there isn't any danger that children in school are going to turn into agents of the CCP or something like that. That it isn't so much about patriotism or not, but simple knowledge about China in the world to come, it should have already been apparent then, is a huge asset to the country as a whole, really, in many ways, culturally, economically, and all the rest of it. It's sort of a no-brainer. Also, I might say that certainly students are very interested, because I had a college role. I was temporarily head of my college, and so I met all the undergraduates, and it was quite striking that the history students were all complaining about the Eurocentric nature of all the history they'd ever been taught. And they were annoyed at not enough African, East Asian, and even American history. And they wished they'd had more, and they were annoyed that the history faculty didn't give them enough by way of options to choose. So, I mean, a slightly disjointed answer, but I think what I'm saying is that it's a bit confused about knowledge about something. It's a bit like what's going on in America now, that to let Black history into the syllabus of American schools is somehow to deny the patriotic sort of side of things, that somehow all the icons that everyone's been teaching about are more important than sort of giving a balanced or even factual, if such a thing is possible, view of history. So I think it's a slightly confused, it's somehow become an issue not about knowledge, but about whose side you're on and you know, are you a proper patriot and that sort of thing, which shouldn't be what it's about. I mean, a real proper patriot who cares about their country should know about China.
Sure. No, and I take the point that I think we should not worry about schools basically recruiting large numbers of communist agents, since most of our great public schools were doing that in the 1950s and sending them to Moscow, as far as I can tell. But that was a different phase of history. I saw you nodding there, Rachel. Could I bring you in here? I just found myself on the back of Robert's answers thinking, is part of the answer to that, whoever that prime minister was, I'm really curious to find out now. When Robert gets back from Japan, I'm going to have to squeeze him. Answering back to that prime minister, is there a case that talking about Chinese history in a wider sense is talking about British history as well?
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to think about it. And, again, to come back to your particular wheelhouse, which is Britain in World War II, I think that it might seem like there is something distinctly unpatriotic about studying World War II in a frame in a theater where they don't necessarily come off as gloriously as Churchill in Europe. But I think that sort of misses the point, because it in widening our understanding of Britain's role in the world in the way that bringing in its actions in the World War II theater would do, I think it would really help to understand how Britain and China in the 20th century are actually co-constituting a global world order in the way that doesn't necessarily look as unpatriotic as it might seem. And I'm always amazed, actually, that I don't get more essays about Britain's role in World War II in admissions documentation, and it's always just sort of Mao and the Great Leap Forward, as though it's easier to study China as a kind of isolated set of events that's so beyond the pale. The tone that is always brought to these admissions essays is, how alien that is and how terrible it is, and look, it's all the way over there, and look what they did to their own people. But actually, to do so is to kind of create a false dichotomy between Britain and China at precisely the time when they are in these deep kinds of connections with each other. So I absolutely think to learn about China more in the 20th century is to learn about Britain more.
Henrietta, would you have an answer to that particular prime minister saying, this isn't something that school kids should be bothering to learn about? Is there an argument, perhaps aside from the argument about patriotism or otherwise, which probably is not, I hope, our primary concern about why children should learn things in school, that would persuade people that actually it would be a good thing for them to know more about Chinese history? Well,
basically, children should be taught about world history generally. I think that schools should give us at some point, the British school system should provide some kind of overview, which it currently doesn't. It gives people slices of history. The Chinese, I think, do put their children through history of China and history of the world as kind of core courses, and you could just do a little of that, and you could get in these things like that the Mongols had an empire that stretched from China to Europe. So I think, clearly China is important, but China is important partly because as Robert says, it's a civilization. People from it are all over the place. It's a much larger thing and part of a global history. It's not necessarily that children in UK schools need to know only about China, because of course there are many, many other places and things they should know about. But I think the problem is that we get comparative dictators. And in fact, an earlier generation got the Mccartney embassy, but we don't get the Mccartney embassy in essays from schools. We get comparative dictators, Mao, Stalin, and in Italy.
Mussolini.
Mussolini, exactly. We get them as comparative dictators, and that is the only thing that gets taught about China in British schools at the moment. And that is deeply problematic. What I can understand, schools want to give children an opportunity to get into a subject, but if they all learn the same thing, perhaps we could rotate the curricula so they're not always the same, and children don't always all learn the same thing. I also wanted to add that Palmerston did not, it turns out, care about China. He declared war on it with the most minuscule amount of interest in the subject. They declared war on the Ottoman. They debated declaring war on the Ottoman Empire and Qing China on 2 consecutive days in October, and they declared the decision was made on the Ottoman Empire on Friday and China on Saturday, and that was the cabinet's decision. It was a very, very minor part, and I think that attitude has also been an ongoing problem.
In other words, this is not necessarily something that's just happened the last few years. There's a much longer history of it as well.